I think that, compared to the average person who has a decent amount of experience playing games, I have a fairly unique perspective when it comes to both the kinds of games I play, as well as the things I look for in a game to judge whether or not it is good. Because of this, I thought it would be interesting to go over what I consider to be the best games from each year, arbitrarily starting with 2011 because I haven't played nearly as many games from before that year. So let's get into that. In retrospect, I could have organized the structure of this video better because we are beginning with my favorite game, Terraria. It might sound weird that Terraria is my favorite game, given the sorts of things I like to talk about on this channel, and while part of me would love to bump up something more artsy to my number one spot, I cannot deny that Terraria is the most consistently fun game I've ever played. Given the game's lengthy series of updates over the past 11 years, Terraria is a very long game, and all those hours of content are of absurdly consistent quality. Over those updates, the developers have refined and perfected that infectious and addictive feeling of getting stronger over time, with so many different routes through the game and so many choices in gear to use that subsequent playthroughs of the game only get marginally more boring. In fact, Terraria's greatest strength is its replayability, to the point where I would call it the most replayable game I've ever played. I have about 2,500 hours in this game, and there are still items I haven't found and weapons and armor I haven't used, which is completely absurd to me given just how much time I've sunk into the game. The game has multiple world sizes, a choice between 2 different evil biomes, and multiple difficulty levels which allow for a great amount of variability in just the world creation menu before starting the game. From there are 4 main damage types with very different sorts of weaponry and playstyles compared to each other to make for great variability and progression through the game. But clearly the greatest boon to Terraria's replayability is its world generation. Terraria is one of the few games which truly uses randomization to its full potential in creating compelling experiences. Of the games which randomly generate worlds for the purpose of exploration, like its closest contemporaries of Minecraft and Starbound, Terraria is the only one which has both environments that are enjoyable to traverse and has exploration which promises tangible gameplay rewards for that exploration in reasonable time. Initial exploration of cave systems is a far more dynamic experience compared to something like Minecraft, as the best gameplay affecting items are not mined out of a wall, but are rather found in unique structures which are often out in the open in the underground. This greatly reduces the number of periodic breaks taken to mine out veins of ore, which generally serve to break the flow of moving through the environment and fighting monsters, promoting a more kinetic playstyle which moves quickly and drives further engagement to see more of the world. Terraria's combat system is built off a very simple foundation, which is made infinitely complex and modifiable through the player's ability to modify the environment, creating arenas for bosses or events which make these fights safer and easier. Depending on how much time you want to spend on preparation, you can completely trivialize every mandatory encounter, which has players unknowingly deciding on their own difficulty levels independent from the game's built-in options. The extra mobility provided by late-game accessories is matched with more difficult fights, with attacks which are more difficult to dodge, allowing for a smooth difficulty curve to play out regardless of how much grind the player subjects themselves to. All the while, a graceful and extremely well-polished curve of overall player power climbs in the background, providing that hit of dopamine whenever you finish the last piece of that armor set, or your new weapon which easily crushes old threats. I could gush about this game's immaculate design for a while, but I'll stop here and end with this. Terraria is an outlier among my favorite games because of what I like it for. It has no story, or at most a few pages of uninteresting lore. It doesn't have any deep meaning past all the bosses and the nonsensical array of items. It's just a game that I'll always come back to whenever I'm looking for some simple, no-strings-attached fun. Every component coalesces into a game that hardly ever gets boring, and even though I've been playing completely unmodded for around 10 years and thousands of hours at this point, I can easily see myself playing it for many years to come. It's because of all this that Terraria is the most fun game I've ever played, and I doubt that will change anytime soon. For 2012, you might have already guessed my pick, especially if you know of popular indies that released that year, and you're familiar with my previous work. Obviously, it's Fez. If you know me for anything, it's probably as the guy that made that one video about Fez, and you can tell from the contents of that video how much I love this game. It's a game of puzzles, mystery, and a feeling of incompleteness that keeps discussion of this game going over 10 years after its release. For me, it's a perfect example of a message being portrayed using very little, using the medium of games to simplify its communication even further. When we find puzzles in games, or anywhere really, we want to solve them, and when we can't solve them, we deconstruct them looking for deeper secrets. But when you deconstruct Fez, the game lodges itself in your mind due to what is potentially still there, hidden deeper than anyone has bothered to go. Given our knowledge of the game at this point, I would say that the most defensible reading of Fez is that the game warns against the enlightenment you naturally want to seek in what hasn't yet been brought to light, and your reward for your efforts could hardly be called that in reality. I would have talked about my runner-up for 2012 in this segment, but I wanted to talk about a surprising new development we received from an unexpected source. Having released so long ago, and with no sequel coming, official updates for anything relating to Fez have almost entirely dried up, with the most recent official communication about anything puzzle-related up to 2022 being Renaud's debunking of the release date theory for the monolith. But April 13th, 2022 marked the 10th anniversary of Fez's release on Xbox Live Arcade, and Eurogamer managed to get an interview on Fez from the game's creator, Phil Fish. This was surprising given his nearly non-existent modern internet footprint, especially compared to how vocal he was in the years surrounding the game's release. But regardless, despite Polytron company policy regarding the monolith being no comment, Phil Fish actually decided to say something on the initial brute force of the puzzle. What surprised us most was how the community brute forced the monolith puzzle. The way they got around to solving it was way more interesting and satisfying than what we had originally intended for it. There's a lot of speculation to make on this quote, since it implies the existence of an intended solution to the infamous monolith, and that the solution was never meant to be forced. Maybe that solution is still out there after over 10 years of searching. Maybe there was a plan for the solution to be revealed externally, leaving the game incomplete thanks to the impatience of those who participated in forcing their own solution. Maybe Phil is just a massive troll. I mean, he also says in this interview that he's constantly making games and canceling them before they release. But more importantly than speculating on the specifics of that intended solution, it's interesting how this development affects the reading of Fez that I put forward in my video on the game. If there was always supposed to be a solution to these unsolvable puzzles, should the idea that the game warns about the enlightenment we naturally seek necessarily be untenable? But I've never been one for authorial intent being the end-all be-all solution to interpreting art, and I think I agree with Phil when he says that the brute force was way more interesting and satisfying in this context. The mysteries that persist to this day color what I think is the most powerfully told ludonarrative in any game to date, and I think it would be a shame for that to be lost simply because of one interview a decade after the fact. The only thing to get over is that, if you want to subscribe to that interpretation, Fez was an accident. But for me, even if it was an accident, it's the greatest accident I've ever played, and I hope I'll still be thinking about this game in another 10 years. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to skip over talking about my Game of the Year for 2013, because The Stanley Parable is a game I've already gushed over in my video about the game's most recent remake. If you want to hear my thoughts on the game, I give them in so much more detail there compared to what I could fit in here. But for now, let's move on. 2014 was a somewhat slow year for indies, or at least indies that I was interested in. Because of this, picking out my favorite game of this year was fairly easy, and it's not even an indie, unlike most of my other favorites. It's Dark Souls 2. It's no surprise that Dark Souls 2 is very different from the rest of FromSoft's contemporary catalog. It's the Super Mario Bros. 2 to Dark Souls Super Mario Bros., with drastic changes to certain mechanics and many additional options for moving through the game, which compromises the feel that some may have been expecting going in with the first game fresh on their mind. But instead of being a retooling of a completely different game to fit the IP, Dark Souls 2 is simply missing the first game's now prolific director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, as a major player in the game's development. But rather than this being proof or rationale for this game's weaknesses, I see it as proof of the strength of FromSoft as a whole, rather than the company's previous success being down to one visionary. But Dark Souls 2 is clearly not a flawless game. Yes, some of the bosses are complete pushovers, and the set of final bosses is by far the most disappointing in the contemporary FromSoft lineup. Yes, some enemies are placed too close to bonfires, and some of those bonfires are a little too close to each other. Yes, the elevator from Earthen Peak to Iron Keep is interesting, and whether that be down to simple oversight or rushed development, it still would have been better off fixed. And yes, ADP was probably an unnecessary inclusion that acts as a beginner's trap for those unfamiliar with what the stat does going in. But I think Dark Souls 2 is better than the first game in a few key areas that I find to be very important to the way I play Souls games, as well as how I enjoy games in general. It's a very subjective thing, but I hope you can at least understand where I'm coming from with this. First, given the freedom the Souls games allow and how players want to play the games, I have a very specific way I like to play them. Specifically, I play only single player, and I like to try out a lot of different weapon types and builds and just play through most of the PvE content. So for me, one of the most important aspects of a Souls game is build variety, and Dark Souls 2 might just be the best out of the 3 mainline games in this respect. For one, power stancing is a massive boon to build variety, allowing for so many different combinations of weapons that is even incentivized by weapons like the Warped Sword and the Bone Fists. On top of this, there are loads of interesting, unique weapons that make for interesting playthroughs, such as the aforementioned Bone Fists, Blue Flame, Saintyr's Spear, Handmaid's Ladle, the entire mundane infusion path. Even your own bare fists can be made into a viable weapon if you're willing to farm the Covenant of Champions. Combine that with the additional options that magic provides, and Dark Souls 2 is easily up there with Dark Souls 3 in being extremely replayable for me. The other standout thing for me in Dark Souls 2 is the game's story, and its overall feel from a narrative perspective. The writing in terms of dialogue is easily the best in the series through Aldia alone. Seriously, this character is the most quotable across all the contemporary FromSoft lineup, and it's not even close.
Men are props in stated life, and no matter how tender, how explicit, alive will remain alive.
But even past that, the game is full of memorable characters, with pieces of dialogue that very effectively set up and develop this world from a tonal perspective. I'm not really one for the Dark Souls lore, but I am definitely one for the Dark Souls themes, and I think Dark Souls 2 is the best at communicating that for players like me, who aren't particularly familiar with every character and their backstories. The difference in this approach can be seen in how all 3 games do their intro cutscenes. Dark Souls 1 and 3 both dole out exposition about the kingdom you're about to visit and the bosses you need to kill on your journey, while Dark Souls 2 has about 15 seconds of discussion of Drangleic, because what's more important is that you don't even know why you're there. More focus is put onto the undead curse and its horrific effects on all the humans that remain in this broken world, and that establishes a very strong tone right out of the gate. I've written more thoroughly on the effectiveness of the game's introduction to its world in another video I made, but the bottom line is that I find Dark Souls 2 to be the most interesting in the series from a tonal and thematic perspective, especially from the point of view of those who aren't familiar with the lore. I could write more on the game's failings, but I'm trying to keep my discussion positive in this video. And even if the game doesn't have the best level design or the best bosses in the series, I still really enjoy playing Dark Souls 2. It's much more enjoyable to replay than Dark Souls 1 for me, and in judging these games off replay value, Dark Souls 2 is on par with both Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. Maybe it's the worst of those 3, but it's still quite good, and with the low level of competition for me in 2014, it gets my pick for Game of the Year. Compared to 2014, 2015 was an explosion in both quantity and quality for indies. There were a lot of great games this year, but there's one clear winner. You might actually be surprised by what I have to say here, which is to say, no, it's not Undertale. Instead, I have to give the nod to one of the most well-refined and deeply thematic stories I've ever seen told. The Beginner's Guide. The Beginner's Guide is a game I could make a long video about, but I don't think I really have to. The game has already gotten plenty of discussion surrounding it, such that there's not much I can add. The reason so much of that discussion exists around this game is because its story was specifically and masterfully designed around generating that kind of discussion. The game goes all in on theme, and it turns out to be one of the most interesting stories I've ever seen told. The story centers around the narrator, a fictional version of Davy Wreden, the game's creator, and his relationship to another character who is only identified as Coda. The game consists of Davy showcasing Coda's games to the player in an attempt to show appreciation towards Coda and his work. This is a fantasy which crumbles as the final few games unfold, and Davy is outed as the reason Coda stopped creating, as Davy violates his boundaries and shows his games to people against his wishes. From this more literal interpretation, The Beginner's Guide is about a friendship which falls apart due to one party's assumed, unfounded belief in the other's depressive and repressed mental state, and the ways these sorts of relationships fall apart due to that misplaced belief. But if you start to think about the game's various absurdities and contradictions, you may start to find that viewing the game from this very literal stance is reductive. There are bits of logistical information that are simply omitted from the text that makes that literal reading hard to justify taking up in place of a more metaphorical reading. For example, a major revelation in Davy's narration over Koda's final game is that he has been significantly editing Koda's games past the blatant edits like skipping the maze or the prison. From adding lampposts to completely altering the way the house cleaning game plays out in its ending, Davy's nature as an unreliable narrator makes this aspect of the text impossible to make objective statements on. We cannot know the extent of Davy's tampering with Koda's games. Davy could have inserted entire games not created by Koda into this collection, and we would never know unless he were to confess to this. And combined with the fact that the Beginner's Guide itself is clearly a work of fiction, in that Koda is a fictional character for whom the real Davy Wreaton made games for in order to fit the narrative he designed, a more metaphorical reading of the game at the level of subtext becomes much more interesting. When you start to look at the game this way, the Beginner's Guide seems to converge around one specific yet extremely broad topic: art. For example, throughout the game, Davy consistently applies analysis of Koda's games, which is centered around defining and getting to know Koda through his work. However, the game's ending reveals this approach to be untenable, showing that we cannot judge the mental state of an artist through their art, despite how much Davy tries to do just that to Koda's games, with that attempt being framed as wholehearted projection on Davy's part. If you play the game again, you might notice more of this pattern subtly strewn throughout. The prison games, for example, can be easily interpreted without referring to Koda at all. A simple reading is that the game is about being so close to an arbitrary goal, yet finishing so far away. The first game frames the well on the other side of the bars as a goal, and you inevitably end up at the bottom of that well, which is a twisted and warped realization of that goal. The furniture maze has dialogue prompts asking you to choose what furniture you want, but your choices are never acted upon, with the implicit goal of decorating the room never materializing in your favor. The escape game features a foolproof method to escape any prison environment, after which your goal is subverted when your prison is missing the first crucial step. Davy doesn't see any of this, and instead he makes these games about Koda. In his eyes, it shows Koda's obsession with this one decorated prison cell, perhaps as a way in which he feels trapped in some abstract psychological way. In this sense, the game argues for radical death of the authorism, where the mental state or ideas of the author should never be taken into account when viewing their work, and the audience's perception should be the only thing that matters. The game also tackles the reasons why people create art through the tension between Davy and Koda's reasons for creating the things they do. Koda is practically the antithesis to Davy in this regard, as he never releases any of his games to any significant public, while Davy admits to feeding off the validation of others to keep his artistic drive going. In the end, Davy projects that aspect of himself onto Koda, and takes matters into his own hands by showing Koda's games to others. Being driven by external validation is characterized by Davy as a disease which drives him to violate Koda's foundational boundary.
More love, more praise, more people telling me that I'm good. Always more. It's like a disease. Even now, the disease is telling me to stop. Don't show people what a shitty person you are. They'll hate you. If I knew that my life depended on finding something to be driven by other than validation, what would that even be? It's strange, but the thought of not being driven by external validation is unthinkable. Like, I actually cannot conceive of what that would be like.
And I could go on, but I feel like I'm already covering a trail with at least 50 other sets of footprints, to put it metaphorically. Hopefully I've communicated what I find so compelling about this game, but to put it simply here, the Beginner's Guide has that property I found so compelling about Kentucky Route Zero, that everyone who plays it will come out thinking it was about something different, and none of those answers are necessarily wrong. Interpretation is the most compelling aspect of art for me, and I find the Beginner's Guide to be the best at encouraging and cultivating that experience in its audience. Although a game like Kentucky Route Zero has a much more complex plot, and thus technically promotes more variation in interpretation, the Beginner's Guide provides more than enough in a tightly paced package that I'm confident anyone could enjoy, even if they aren't inclined to think about it in that deeper way. This is why the Beginner's Guide is easily one of the strongest stories I've ever had the joy of experiencing, and for that, it is easily deserving of Game of the Year. 2016 had a lot of interesting releases, with surprisingly stiff competition for the top spot. Firewatch is a classic first-person story game which makes some really interesting narrative decisions that I can't help but respect. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is the only Deus Ex game that I've had the patience to play through, and it boasts some incredibly fun stealth challenges and a compact open world that is a joy to explore, especially in its verticality. Dark Souls 3 is my favorite of the three mainline Souls games, sporting some of the best bosses and levels the series has ever seen. Devil Daggers is a game I've already talked about multiple times on this channel, being one of the best games of all time in terms of all possible meanings of the word design, and a game that I consistently come back to in order to push myself past my limits. To beat out all that would take a game that is truly special. That game is One Shot. I'm going to reiterate my spoiler warning here. Skip to the next chapter if you have not played One Shot. One Shot is also a game that I've already talked about on this channel, though I really only scratched the surface of what it does, only covering the first 10 to 20 minutes of the game. It's a testament to this game's greatness that I can so thoroughly gush over just the game's introduction, yet what happens in the rest of the game might be even better, and I want to talk about all of it, so you can consider this section as something of a mini essay on this game. So let's get into that. For the rest of One Shot to work, the game introduces its world and its concept in an absolutely unforgettable way. I've talked about it before, and you can go look at that video if you're interested. But to summarize, the game grabs what is very likely your real name from the local profile on your computer and uses it to directly implicate you in the story. In One Shot, you play as yourself, not as another character in the story. It's a trick that it pulls off with such confidence that you might not even realize that you're being tricked, but I'll touch on that later. Regardless, you are cast as the god of this world and told to escort Nico, your messiah, to the tower in order to replace the world's dead sun to prevent it and all its inhabitants from withering away. Once this is done, Nico will be able to leave this world and return home, or so many characters assume. You move through the world by exploring, finding items, combining those items, and using the environment to solve puzzles. But there are a few puzzles that stand out from these, which follow the precedent set by the game's intro. In the first area, there's a safe with a code that doesn't exist anywhere in this world, but it does exist outside of it, in a text file in your own documents folder. In the second area, the game changes your desktop background to reveal the solution to this tile puzzle. And in the third area, you use the ability to move the game's window to expose this film to the void, or the space beyond the edges of your monitor, in order to access the elevator to the surface. These moments lead up to the game's final choice. A force you've encountered throughout the game, identified now as the Entity, tries to trick you into thinking the game is over. It wants to keep you from climbing the tower, though you're assisted by another, even more mysterious character in order to finish your journey. In the notes left for you, it's revealed that the sun is the Messiah's tie to this world, and if you place the sun in the tower and save the world, Nico can never leave. But if you destroy the sun, the world will end in an instant. And it's here, nearing the top of the tower, that the Entity presents you with the final choice. Why are you trying so hard for this? Haven't you figured out what this world is? I told you at the beginning, your mission is to help Nico leave, because Nico isn't a part of this world. Nico is the only thing worth saving here. The final choice is up to you. I can't go against my programming. If you choose to smash the light bulb, then Nico wakes up back home, like it was all a dream. But if you let Nico return the sun, the child will have to bear the weight of this sacrifice. The final choice is a trolley car case. Do you save Nico and end the world, or do you save the world and trap Nico forever? The obvious choice is to place the sun and leave Nico behind, but it might not be that simple, an idea which is hinted at in those previous lines. Haven't you figured out what this world is? Because Nico isn't a part of this world. Nico is the only thing worth saving here. The world isn't real. You're playing a video game full of simulated people on your computer. Embracing the conceit that Nico is the only real person here, suddenly foregoing everyone else and just saving Nico doesn't sound like the worst option. But as it turns out, this choice matters even less than I've been letting on, because you could just delete your save file and play the game again. Though, considering this game's nature, you wouldn't expect it to be that simple. In the same way that the game knows you exist, it knows that this has all happened before. The first playthrough of One Shot is more like a tech demo than a game. We get to see all the neat things that can be done with the puzzles, and how those can be woven into a simple adventure narrative. And while it's good, I wouldn't think so highly of this game if it wasn't for the game's second playthrough. In reality, it's more like the game's second half, with the path through the game as well as its overall tone taking a significant turn. Specifically on tone, the game is much darker, with Nico being faced with a deep existential dread after remembering that this has all happened before. The subtext of the game's world being fake is made explicit by Proto, a character placed here by the world's creator in order to fix the damage done to the entity, which is now identified as the World Machine. Proto explicitly acknowledges that you are playing a video game. To you, it's no different than any other recreational game-type software you may have installed on your computer. Nico is now aware that it's all just fake. From here, the game continues to darken considerably, and characters are continually corrupted by the World Machine's disrepair, embodied by the square anomalies that are now appearing at a far more rapid pace compared to the first playthrough. First, it was the robot engineer in the mines, then the forest spirit sacrifices herself to help Nico, and as Nico flies to the refuge, the two children from the ruins are trapped at the graveyard. Even more so on this return to the world, your quest feels futile, as all your NPC friends are consumed by the world itself. But it's here in the refuge that Nico meets up with Rue, one of the three characters placed here to assist Nico in fixing the World Machine. As they believe their goals to be unattainable, they sit at the balcony of the tallest building in the refuge, and Rue begins to talk about taming. Do you know what a robot is? A robot is not a real person, is it? It's a being whose entire existence is code, inflexible programming with thoughts dictated by someone else's design. They can be copied, they can be mass-produced, then can be assigned all sorts of jobs. And most importantly, they will never confuse themselves with the living. They will always be bound by their code, the knowledge that they are a robot. But while you can't build a robot to not follow its code, you can establish a special bond with it. If the strength of that bond is strong enough, the robot's mental capacity will start to develop outside of its programming. In a way, it's starting to believe itself as a real, valid individual. It's a complete suspension of disbelief on your end, though. You have to fully embrace the robot as a genuine, living person, even knowing they are not. You need to spend a lot of time with it, treat it like a good friend, devoting your heart to the robot until it is able to return your feelings. One shot ends with Nico meeting the World Machine and taming it in a beautiful scene filled with such moving emotion, and I can't help but note how good the music is here. In the end, the world is finally saved, every character lost along the way is brought back, and Nico is finally allowed to wake up. It all ends so perfectly, and if you want to leave it at that, One Shot is still one of the most incredible emotional experiences I've ever had playing a game. It's a story that really pulls you in a more literal sense than that expression is generally used for, and it uses that resulting immersion to instill incredible emotion. But because of the sorts of games I like digging into, I find something else in this game that I love even more. One Shot is able to provide a complete emotional package if you accept the conceit of its story uncritically, but I think some very interesting questions arise if you decide to challenge that conceit. The game's core conceit is that, while the world you explore and all its characters are a simple program running on your computer, Nico is a real person, taken from another world and made to be this world's savior. This is, of course, a complete lie, covered up by several layers of clever trickery. Nico is just as much a scripted part of the game as any of the other characters. And the game does follow a strict script down to its final moments, despite the act it puts on in the second playthrough as if you're really going out of bounds. That's why robots are such an important part of this world, as they are reflections of the game's nature. They are simple beings made entirely of code, restricted by their programming. The robots in the human settlement at the Barrens are still bound by their programming to escort humans to their dorms, and they continue to search for humans even though everyone is evacuated. The puzzle required to reach the refuge results entirely from a robot who absolutely needs a signature to let Nico pass, despite the dire circumstances. There's also this robot that is unable to leave its post at the refuge's generator, and as such is unable to help fix the elevator. In the same way that these robots are so heavily restricted, the game itself is entirely scripted throughout its entire runtime, with an inability to deviate from its script in any meaningful way. This is why taming is so important as a concept, because the world machine in-universe functions as a robot, and it being untamed results in the square anomalies becoming permanent. Only after Nico tames it can the world machine undo the damage and restore the world. But of course, this is all an act. Every part of this game is thoroughly planned by its developers, a plan which could not possibly be deviated from. But through the concept of taming, the game asks, does it matter? Because taming, and the game as a whole, is all about suspension of disbelief. In the final confrontation with the world machine, a quote stood out to me. As Nico expresses the belief that the characters in this world do have something real about them, it responds, "They are code too, you know this. Their behavior all derived from a predetermined matrix of actions, all extensions of my own programming." On the surface, this line is directed at Nico, as this world's true nature has been revealed as a simulation. Nico knows that there is nothing real about these people. Their behavior is simply dictated by the game's code, which presents some illusion of existence. However, I like to think of this line as serving a dual purpose, and also addressing the player, because on some level, the player knows that every part of this game, including Nico, is an illusion. But the follow-up question to that is, if you see right through this illusion so cynically, why would you keep going? Why would you return after the ending if you didn't believe the game's impossible conceit to some degree? The game takes your mere presence here as proof of your own suspension of disbelief, and with that, you participate in the world machine's taming. I find this idea particularly interesting because of how it fits in with other games that similarly involve the player in their story. One Shot released right in between its two wildly successful peers, Undertale and Doki Doki Literature Club. When I played One Shot all the way through one night in late 2021, it felt like the missing link in the canon of indie meta-narratives because of this focus around the player's suspension of disbelief. To speak on the other game I'm most familiar with, Undertale features characters who know of the player's impact on the story, with Flowey in particular speaking on the game's sets of numbers and lines of dialogue, which are rigid and unchanging. This implies some level of sentience that Flowey has that is unique among other characters in the game. But just like Nico being a real person, this isn't possible, and at some level you know that this isn't possible, and it's something that both games expect you to just accept uncritically. Prior to my playthrough of One Shot, I always wondered what a story that addressed that aspect of these stories would look like, and One Shot does it better than I ever could have hoped for by weaving it into its emotional core. In spite of its impossible concept, it pulls you in by directly implicating you in its story, giving you a surprisingly compelling reason to care about these characters. And then, after the long-winded lore explanations behind the world machine's creation, after the additional impossibilities introduced as the game progresses, and after the game directly acknowledges that you know you are being tricked, it simply asks, do you still believe me? What do you have to lose by believing? And finally, will you remember me? I think I'll remember this game for a very long time. 2017 is another that you might be able to guess given my previous videos, and yes, it is Night in the Woods. I've already gone into too much detail on everything to do with this game, but I'd like to quickly talk about myself, which is fitting for this game that I saw so much of myself in. That's the reason I made the first of my long essays on this game, because of how moved I was by the story, and how strongly I connected with the struggles of its characters. May is a character I saw a lot of myself in, at least from the perspective of her mental state more so than any economic struggles. I felt useless at the time, like I had nothing of substance to offer to the world, in just the same way that May feels like a material drain to her community. I felt like my life wasn't going anywhere, and that I was wasting so much time that could be spent on my future, in just the same way that May runs away from her responsibilities in order to live in short-term happiness. And that's why I felt the need to make something that I could put out into the world and be happy with. So with a surplus of free time due to the events of 2020, I started this channel with a video about this game. I feel a lot better about my spot in life now, especially now that I have this channel as a project to pour my free time into. But as a result, I don't feel so strongly about Night in the Woods anymore. I still find the game incredibly well made in nearly every aspect, but the personal connection I once felt is missing. Though even if I don't feel that same emotion that I once did when I go back to play this game, I still owe a lot to Night in the Woods. As I stated in the introduction of that first video, I think stumbling upon the demo for this game by chance and subsequently buying it was something of a turning point in my life, now for even more reasons than I had when I wrote it. Aside from the game having been an amazing, personally touching experience for me, I'm confident that I never would have taken this path of trying to make video essays about weird indie art games if I had never played Night in the Woods. So I have to give my thanks, because it really has been a pleasure to do this for the last couple years, and I hope to continue for as long as I can. I don't have much new to say on Night in the Woods in particular at the moment, but we'll see if that changes in the future. 2018 felt like a somewhat sparse year for me in terms of games, but it didn't feel out of place in terms of quality in the same way that 2014 did. In fact, this might be another one that's easy to guess. For 2018, it's Celeste. Celeste is the undisputed gold standard for precision platformers. It has all the aspects that design nerds love to gush over. It's a game with a simple control scheme that finds depth in building on that simple foundation, rather than bloating the game with unnecessary abilities. The level design constantly iterates on the gameplay, with new level gimmicks being combined with older ones to create an incredible amount of variation in obstacles and general challenge from level to level. Thanks to its linear structure, the game paces itself very well, with difficulty spikes being practically non-existent in the main line of levels. But for those looking for more brutal challenges, the post-game doesn't disappoint for those who want to see these mechanics pushed to their reasonable limits. But the most important part, or parts, of what makes Celeste work are those level gimmicks, and specifically how they augment player movement. The act of mastering these gimmicks and moving through these levels is made so much more satisfying in the way that most of those gimmicks help the player to move in so many different ways, and generally move faster thanks to the incredibly satisfying conservation of momentum that the game constantly capitalizes on. Rather than the levels being full of obstacle cycles and annoying waiting periods, they're full of opportunities for the player to move faster and better, which I think is inherently more satisfying than the former. I also think this is why the wind and Chapter 4 in general is the worst part of the game, since it gets in the way of player movement a lot of the time. But that example is definitely an outlier, rather than being the standard across the game. Celeste's game design has been analyzed and picked apart by so many others at this point, but what really kept me going when playing this game for the first time was the narrative. The way the game goes about communicating conflict through the main character's externalized mental health issues feels a bit oversaturated in indies today, but it's important to note that Celeste can be considered one of the progenitors of this trend. The backdrop of climbing a mountain is brilliant in its simplicity, and how it fits in with Madeline's struggle of feeling stuck in life, just needing a goal to work towards to help get out of the rut in her mind. The ups and downs of Madeline's journey are rendered masterfully through the structure of the story, the tone evoked by its presentation, and the excellent writing throughout. There's even some nuance to the mental health angle the game takes, and how it's interpretable as a trans allegory, considering the subtext of Madeline having trouble with mirrors, with that interpretation practically being made textual in the final cutscene of Chapter 9. While the story appears simple and even somewhat derivative to someone who plays a lot of these narrative-focused indie games, there's a lot of depth here that elevates the game above its peers. Overall, Celeste is not just the gold standard for precision platformers, it's also a very well-told story that makes for an incredible overall emotional experience. The game just seems to do everything right, so for me, it's an easy pick for Game of the Year. 2019 is my favorite year for games thus far. The sheer quantity and quality of games from 2019 is incomparable in my eyes. No other year comes close. But even with the quantity, there's still a clear winner in terms of quality. It's Outer Wilds. For the final time, I'm going to stress the importance of not getting spoiled. Skip to the next chapter if you have not played Outer Wilds. There's a genre of game that's been slowly pumping out very high-quality games in the background of indie development, the mystery genre. The genre can be described as an offshoot of the adventure game, but with an emphasis on unique narrative-driven puzzles. 2018 had Return of the Obra Dinn, which is another very high-quality release that I would recommend to everyone, and there have been other smaller releases over time, such as the Frog Detective games and others. And in just the same way that Celeste is the gold standard for precision platformers, Outer Wilds is the gold standard for the mystery game. But before getting to that, I'd like to talk about puzzle games in general for a bit, and more specifically what I'll refer to as hardcore puzzle games. The hardcore puzzler is a genre characterized most clearly by games like Baba Is You and Steven's Sausage Roll, games made up of very intensely mechanically focused puzzles with little to no story to speak of. More accessible puzzle games like the Portal series use its story to give context to the puzzles that gives a more intuitive motivation to continue solving puzzles. But for the more hardcore side of the genre, your only reward for solving puzzles is more puzzles, and maybe the knowledge that you're one tiny, insignificant step closer to reaching whatever the game's ending may be. These sorts of games are difficult to get into for those who aren't enjoying the puzzles in and of themselves, and while I could admire the brilliant minimalist design principles that these games embrace, actually playing them is a different story, for me at least. I say all that because the mystery genre as a whole, and more specifically in this case Outer Wilds, is the antithesis of the design philosophies in the hardcore puzzler. Rather than puzzles being finely tuned boxes to check off a list in order to unlock more boxes to check, Outer Wilds is a large, vibrant, living world with puzzles so inexorably tied to its story that separating gameplay from narrative is impossible. Progressing through the game isn't just about mastering the zero-G control scheme and learning the hidden mechanical workings of these alien worlds, it's also about learning the history of the ancient race that came before the player character's civilization. Every facet of the game intertwines to form a complex web that the game lets you untangle, with strongly incentivized exploration leading to plot discoveries, leading to new leads and new places to explore, leading to hints on how to solve one of 4 overarching mysteries that conclude with major plot revelations. The exploratory gameplay loop is refined to perfection, with every planet being packed with various important discoveries to be made and pieces of history to uncover. All the while, the time loop provides a more abstract, puzzle-like bent to that exploration. All this combines to make the act of solving the game's mysteries an incredibly freeing, frictionless experience. But that's only one part of the game, because if the mystery itself ends up unsatisfying from a writing standpoint, it doesn't matter how well the game subtly guides you around to solve it. Luckily, the story of Outer Wilds is a layered masterpiece, which culminates in one of the greatest endings I've ever seen in any story ever. The game's gameplay loop is reflected in the story of both the Nomai and the Harthians, both species that seek discovery and enlightenment, and only through the combined knowledge of peoples long rendered extinct can the player character finally reach the final enlightenment, the Eye of the Universe. But this story isn't one of consistently joyous discovery, with the game slowly revealing the futility of the unfortunate situation the Harthians have been placed in, just before the expiration date of their universe. Distant stars can be spotted slowly dying off in just the same way that the sun in this system marks the final moments of the miraculous time loop. It's only because of that time loop set in place so long ago by the Nomai that the player character is able to learn enough about the Nomai and the solar system to find the Eye and make their final voyage there. But by this point, especially if you visited the Sun Station and paid attention to some of the other Harthians, you may be fully aware that this universe is irreversibly on a path towards its end. If you missed it before, in the Eye you're forced to watch every star go out one by one in a wonderfully somber moment enhanced by the cosmic scale the story takes on. But it's also because of that cosmic scale that I think what happens afterwards works so well. The game's ending is materially pointless in the scope of its plot. The universe was always on this track from the very start of the game, even from the very first moments of the universe the game takes place in. You cannot do anything to stop it, or even slow it down. That's why it's so important that the rest of the ending is relentlessly positive and optimistic. The game tells you to accept the inevitable and make the most of the time you have left, with these final moments comprising of one last song played around a campfire by your fellow explorers. It's a story of enormous galactic scale that is masterfully brought down to a level of simple human emotion in this final scene. While all those discoveries you made and mysteries you solved may have been for nothing, those acts in and of themselves are reward enough for your efforts, a sentiment communicated elegantly over the past 10 to 15 hours of thoroughly engaging gameplay. And while it may be over now, you can be glad you're here to witness it, the beginning of something new. Outer Wilds is a great story told in an exceptional way, using the branching web of player choice and exploration to communicate its message with incredible clarity. The intersection of narrative and ludonarrative is a rare thing to see in games, even ones with standout stories, and it's what makes Outer Wilds exceptional, even next to the other similarly exceptional releases from 2019. And just as a bonus, the game's expansion is just as good as the original game, building out an interesting, alternate perspective from that of the Nomai that comes with its own story and themes. So with all that said, I would confidently say that Outer Wilds is not only the gold standard for the mystery game, but also for exploration and video games in general, and it's easily my game of the year for 2019. 2020 was another great year for games. While it didn't have the quantity that 2019 had on its side, it definitely had some very good releases that elevated above other years. You may expect me to call Kentucky Route Zero the best given my very long video on the game, but 2020 also brought a worthy follow-up to not just one of the greatest indies of all time, but one of the greatest games period. It's Spelunky 2. A lot of people consider Spelunky HD to be a perfect game, which is a sentiment I entirely understand. Every aspect of the game, the controls, the level generation, the enemies, the visuals, etc., are all fine-tuned to be difficult yet approachable. It's the epitome of the phrase, easy to learn, hard to master. On the surface, it's a simple roguelike platformer, but if you dig deeper, you find a game of intricate systems, hidden tricks, and so many discoveries to be made to the point that the community surrounding the game is still finding new things to this day. I think you could get away with calling HD a perfect game, but what Spelunky 2 does so well is that it builds so much more content on top of that perfect foundation. Changes to the formula are made sparingly, and only to benefit the flow of players' first steps towards their first successful runs, as well as the variety of strategies at the top level. All the subtle mechanical changes, such as more forgiving whip hitboxes, arrow traps being a bit less oppressive, shopkeepers being less insane, etc., all serve to make the game more consistent compared to the occasionally janky systems of HD. The addition of the Cosmic Ocean as a final endurance challenge is something I've already covered a while ago on this channel, but to keep it short, the endurance challenge is something I never knew I needed to see in the Spelunky formula, and I'm so glad it's in Spelunky 2 as a perfect challenge for the most skilled players. Overall, Spelunky 2 makes purposeful changes to the Spelunky formula that give the game so much more variety, on top of massive amounts of new content to discover and master. While Spelunky HD might be a perfect game, Spelunky 2 is a perfect game that just has more, which of course calls into question what makes a game perfect, but I won't get too deep into that here. I could go into every minute detail of both of these games, but I'd like to talk about Spelunky in general, and more specifically, why both Spelunky HD and Spelunky 2 are easily the greatest roguelikes ever made. A lot of other roguelikes and roguelites are built around combat. This is understandable, as combat is the simplest gameplay to build around random level generation, since the enemies are more so the focus than the environments. Randomness in these games is more about keeping the game fresh by providing slight alterations to combat encounters that would otherwise get repetitive quickly, and to mix up what abilities the player can utilize through providing random items. But Spelunky does things very differently, because it almost entirely lacks combat. Most enemies either die or are stunned in one hit, while others are usually taken care of by bombs or a shotgun without putting out much of a fight. This alternate focus is most clearly seen in how the Olmec boss fight in both games is handled. If one could just throw a few bombs at the boss and kill it just like that, there would be no challenge. So instead it's a challenge of how both the player and Olmec interact with the fully destructible environments, and how the player can use Olmec to their advantage to bring him down to the lava pit at the bottom of the arena. What the Spelunky games do so well is that they're not about the mastery of an unchanging combat system, they're rather about the levels themselves, and how you go about traversing them in safe, reasonably quick ways while using as few resources as possible. The random level generation, what roguelikes are known for, is used to greater effect in the Spelunky games than in any other roguelike, because the games are all about learning how to react to every possible layout of both obstacles and enemies with the help of a relatively small pool of potential items. The randomness is less about combating monotony, and it's rather about creating unique obstacles through the placement of enemies that players must master in order to consistently get through levels. Because of that experience of learning about and mastering the game's systems, Spelunky makes the player feel powerful because of their achievements and what challenges they're capable of surmounting, rather than how combat-centered roguelikes oftentimes do this with a thrilling power trip, allowing the player to become ludicrously powerful by stacking items forever. In Spelunky, your character is kept in a humble, fragile state. One slip-up can sometimes mean instant death, though those obstacles are very well telegraphed, which keeps the challenge fair, with the vast majority of deaths being entirely the fault of the player for making the wrong decisions or for failing a reasonably generous window for execution. No item you can find allows you to entirely circumvent any part of that challenge the game provides, so every step you take to get closer to mastery over the game's systems is yours. That incredible feeling of overcoming overwhelming odds is more powerful in the Spelunky games than in any other game I've ever played, and that's a feeling I think everyone should experience. The Spelunky games give back exactly what you put into them, and I'm glad to have sunk so many hours into these two games, especially Spelunky 2. That's why it's deserving of my top spot for 2020, and a spot as one of the greatest games in general as well. I played a lot of flawed games in 2021, a few of which I've made videos about, and some other releases are very debatable as to whether or not they're even eligible, so picking my game of the year was a bit tricky. But there's one game that stands out to me as having something really interesting about it, and that's Death's Door. But before discussing that game in particular, I need to talk about a different game first, a game called Titan Souls. Titan Souls is a very interesting game to me. The basic concept behind the gameplay is that all the bosses you fight throughout the game are just as fragile as you are. You die in one hit, but the bosses also die from one well-placed arrow, which allows for some really fun boss designs that are very satisfying to overcome. The art style, combining the intricate pixel art with 3D modeled characters, works surprisingly well, especially during the secret final boss Truth, and the game's soundtrack is also fantastic. I really enjoyed Titan Souls for its simple charm and unique concept, enough so that I bothered to play through it multiple times to try out its alternate difficulties. But this game is also a bit divisive, and even though I did like it quite a bit, even I have to admit that the game is still decently flawed. When you're actually playing the game it's great, but the issue comes with much of what you're made to do when not in the boss fights. The game has an open world that is used very sparingly for a couple secrets, though I enjoyed running through it well enough because of the well-done pixel art and music, so I didn't mind so much. What's more of an issue is how the game handles death. Across the game world, there are a few hubs that have a few bosses in close proximity, which each have a checkpoint that you go back to upon death. This means that you have to run back from the checkpoint to the boss every time you die. The runs to these bosses can last anywhere from 10 to 25 seconds, and there's no interesting challenge here, just running in a line from point A to point B. This could have easily been avoided by prompting after death if you wanted to start at the boss you died at or back at the checkpoint, and a lot of people were put off the game because of this. This issue is made a lot worse because of that one-hit gimmick that can cause the run back to the boss to last longer than the actual attempt on the boss itself. I found that the game's difficulty was well tuned to my preferences, such that this issue wasn't that bad for me, but for those who had more trouble with the bosses than me, I understand that it becomes much more frustrating. Despite its flaws, Titan Souls was definitely a game that left an impression on me, even if it was mostly for its aesthetic charms. So it was odd to me that the game came out in 2015, but in the 5 years between the game releasing and me playing it, the team behind the game still hadn't released anything new, despite being signed on with Devolver. But it turns out they were just very busy all those years, and in 2021, Death's Door was released. For the most part, Death's Door is a simple but very well-polished indie game. It clearly takes lots of inspiration from Zelda games and a bit of Dark Souls with the iframe dodge roll. Combat is simple but decently fun, but much like the Zelda games, the real appeal of this game is its world and level design, and it really does feel like it's at the level of the Zelda games, just at a somewhat smaller scale. The main puzzles are simple yet satisfying, and discovering all the varied secrets scattered around the world is enjoyable as well. Along with that, much like Titan Souls before it, the game has an incredible sense of style. The game's art direction is very strong and very consistent throughout, and the music is phenomenal, with standout tracks including Avarice and The Old Watchtowers. If nothing else, I would highly suggest checking out this game's soundtrack. It's full of both exciting combat songs and more mellowed out ambient pieces that fit the game's world flawlessly. However, there was one thing in this game that stood out to me, and that comes with its story. For most of the game, the story is fairly simple, mostly serving as a backdrop to give reason for you to visit all these places and kill all these bosses. It's not that interesting, but after the game's final boss leaves a key behind in a post-credits scene, the post-game of Death's Door begins. The nighttime versions of each outdoor location all hide relatively involved puzzles that slowly build towards a secret ending. Along the way, there are a few hints towards what that ending will be, which I first picked up on when I noticed the design of this door in the cemetery, and when I finally opened it, there was a familiar sound that accompanied it. Then, when I opened the game's final living chest, those hints were made much more explicit. The twist at the very end of the post-game is that Death's Door is a continuation on the story of Titan Souls, with the ending implicating your crow in the plans of the omniscient deity Truth, the secret final boss from Titan Souls. It was such a great surprise to me that I didn't even mind that there wasn't a boss to fight here. That may sound strange for me to say, and you may think that there's nothing particularly special about this. It may just seem like a game that connects to the dev team's previous game, and that's it. I think my reaction comes down to a few different things. Firstly, I think I enjoyed Titan Souls more than most, and I think that it left a stronger impression on me than most as well. So for people like me who you could consider fans of Titan Souls, Death's Door has a lot of small references to the previous game to pick up on. Both the tutorial boss and the Yeti boss at the top of the mountain borrow very heavily from boss designs in Titan Souls, and the sequences set inside the living chests also play an arrangement of the song Avarice from the Titan Souls soundtrack. To see these neat references flourish into a more direct connection was very entertaining to see unravel in the game's last couple hours. But more so than that, the true experience of this secret ending felt somewhat exclusive to me. It may be a bit self-centered, but Titan Souls seems to me like a game that most people have forgotten about in the years since its release, though for me it was relatively fresh in my memory. In my mind, when Death's Door released, Titan Souls was a game that was remembered for its flaws and shortcomings, if anything at all. But with Titan Souls managing to make a surprisingly big impression on me, I felt like I got more out of Death's Door than a lot of others did. Maybe that sounds like a strange, egotistical reason to have enjoyed the ending so much, and it may even be somewhat delusional on my part, but I think it's the same feeling you get when you discover something truly great that very few people seem to be aware of, and how those things feel more special to you because it's somewhat esoteric knowledge. But that's just my take on it, and that's the best explanation I have for why this bit of the game resonated so much with me. But to wrap up, Death's Door is a game that is plainly fun in most regards, and while normally that wouldn't be enough to move it up to Game of the Year status, my very subjective experience with both this and the developer's previous game from years ago makes the game stand out to me, and I'm happy to give it Game of the Year regardless. While I usually don't play brand new releases often, 2022 has still brought a few stellar games of the few that I've played thus far. But even though I haven't played that many, there's still one that clearly rises above the rest for me, and I don't expect it to be beaten. 2022 brought with it one of the most anticipated game releases of all time, and it somehow managed to live up to that extreme anticipation. It's Elden Ring. Now this may be a controversial opinion, and maybe a somewhat unfounded one since I haven't played Bloodborne or Demon Souls because Sony, but I think Elden Ring is the best FromSoft RPG so far. In the 13 years since Demon Souls released on the PS3, Miyazaki and the rest of FromSoft have clearly mastered their craft, and Elden Ring is the culmination of every step leading up to it. To start, Elden Ring's open world is both beautiful thanks to the excellent FromSoft art direction, but it's also a lot of fun to explore mechanically with the satisfying and well-animated horseback movement. Seeing a huge landmark off in the distance is exciting thanks to the tangible gameplay rewards these locations offer, and discovering hidden mini-dungeons tucked into cliffsides is always a treat as well. But even with this incredibly well-designed open world, they don't skimp out on the classic Souls levels, and with the more versatile movement Elden Ring allows, there are so many novel level design tricks and hidden rewards strewn about these areas. Stormvale Castle, Leyndell, and Farum Azula all rank among some of my favorite areas in all the Souls games, while others like Elfale and Volcano Manor aren't quite on that level, but they're all still great. It's the definition of quality over quantity, as these areas are completely stuffed with so many hidden side routes and secret items that I could spend hours clearing out just one of the 6 main levels. The classic Souls-like combat is also iterated upon in Elden Ring in some really positive ways to help keep things fresh, not just in transitioning from the previous games, but also between different builds within the game. First of all, power stancing is back, and with so much more variety than it had in Dark Souls 2, which is of course great for build variety. Combined with the huge array of weapons, and the ability to put many different Ashes of War on vanilla weapons, makes for a game with an incredible amount of replay value, even next to its similarly exceptional predecessors. But aside from how builds are set up, Elden Ring makes meaningful changes to the mechanics of PvE combat that are all built around a single mechanic: stance breaking. In the previous games, offense is for the most part defined by light attacks, the occasional running attack when approaching enemies, and maybe parrying for a select set of enemies. But Elden Ring elegantly promotes more variety in offense through the introduction of stance breaking. Similar to Sekiro before it, attacks deal both health and stance damage, but the scaling for stance damage on heavier, riskier attacks greatly outscales their health damage. Enemy stance heals after a time, which creates a great risk-reward aspect to the combat by rewarding the player for staying close and keeping up the pressure with riskier attacks, along with further encouraging the player to mix up their choices when attacking to get those satisfying critical hits that have become iconic throughout the series. The other thing to talk about in Elden Ring are the bosses, which is an aspect of the game I think I look at more fondly than others. You could say that there are some dud bosses found in the mini-dungeons, and that some of them are reused normal enemies or reused bosses from earlier in the game, but my view is that the excellent Souls combat is enough to make these bosses enjoyable for me, such that I don't mind the recycling too much. The endgame bosses do go a bit beyond those from games past, but this is also something I really appreciate as someone who has played through Dark Souls 2 and 3 at least 10 times each. To speak on the most obvious example of brutal difficulty in the game, many people have brought up issues with the Malenia boss fight in critiquing Elden Ring, and while Waterfowl Dance could probably be toned down just a bit, I love this fight a lot for the same reason I enjoyed Sister Frida from Dark Souls 3's DLC. Both fights go beyond simply learning when to press the dodge button and when you can safely attack, and they require you to play proactively with your defense and space yourself properly when the boss is in an actionable state. They are both incredibly punishing when learning their attacks for the first time, but because of that, they're also incredibly rewarding challenges to conquer, and picking apart Malenia was some of the most fun I've had with a boss in a Souls game since I was stuck on bosses for days at a time my first time playing Dark Souls 3. My enjoyment of these bosses is a very subjective thing, but they ended up being the perfect challenge to blissfully throw myself against for hours, which is exactly what I wanted from this game. Elden Ring is one of the best new releases I've played in a while, and it managed to live up to the incredible amount of hype that surrounded the radio silence following its initial teaser. I also consider it the best out of a legendary series from a legendary developer. It's a game, just like its predecessors, that I'll probably be coming back to for a very long time, and it is absolutely deserving of Game of the Year because of that. While that's the end of the main part of this video, I'd like to have a greater point to build towards at the end of these scripts, so I'll just say this. There are some who would have you believe that the games industry is dying, and that video games as a whole are getting worse as the years go on, and this is a sentiment I completely reject. Maybe it's somewhat true for AAA development, but you just have to look to indies to see that video games as an art form are thriving. 2019 was my favorite year for games because it was so full of incredibly high-quality single-player releases that I didn't get to talk about. A Short Hike, Katana Zero, Superliminal, Sekiro, and Pathologic 2 are all excellent games that would easily contend for Game of the Year had 2019 not brought with it an even more standout release. The following years were not quite as good, but I don't think video games have ever been as interesting and thought-provoking as they are now. So in conclusion, I just don't see the industry and video games as a whole declining. I think you just need to shift away from the plane of AAA yearly releases, games as services, and obnoxious predatory microtransactions to see the true growth that this medium has had over the past 12 years, and I can't wait to see where we go from here.